Almost all objects in a Kubernetes cluster exist inside some namespace. We can think of a namespace as a way to define a virtual cluster with some resources within it. In this way, by specifying or creating different namespaces, we can have multiple virtual clusters inside the same physical cluster. Each namespace corresponds to one virtual cluster. That's one good way of understanding what namespaces do. By default, when we create a Kubernetes cluster, there are going to be 3 namespaces already in existence. The first of these is called default. This is a default namespace for objects where no other namespace is explicitly specified by the administrator or the user. The second pre-existing namespace is called kube system. This is a namespace for all objects created by Kubernetes. And the third namespace is called kube public. This is a globally accessible and automatically readable namespace. All users, even those who are not authenticated, can make use of resources which are in the kube public namespace. This is mostly used for cluster usage, for resources that need to be made available throughout the cluster. Namespaces in Kubernetes, just like namespaces in programming languages, provide a scope for names. So objects only need to have unique names within a namespace. You can reuse object names across namespaces. In future versions of Kubernetes, the idea is that objects in the same namespace will all have the same access control policies by default. You should also keep in mind that you do not need to use namespaces merely for versioning or for resources which are only slightly different from each other. In a situation like that, you can just make use of labels. So again, do not use namespaces simply in order to create different versions of the same object. Use labels instead. Finally, let's address a little asterisk. At the start of this video, we said that almost all objects in Kubernetes live in namespaces. And indeed, there are some objects which do not live in any namespace. These are typically low-level objects such as nodes and persistent volumes. Most Kubernetes resources such as pods, replica sets, deployments, services, etc. are going to reside in a namespace.